Hi, in this example, we're going to take this graph of this periodic function here and construct a function for it, a sine or cosine. A couple of things I want to note is that whatever function we choose, notice that the angle of the trigonometric function doesn't have a horizontal shift. It has just a kx. And we may have a vertical shift, but a horizontal we don't. So which is nice because it kind of eliminates a step for us. Okay, and down below here, I went ahead and copy and pasted from the book of all the properties of the functions, the trigonometric functions, sine and cosine. Okay, so where do we start? Well, I think the first thing we want to do is actually choose sine or cosine because we could sine or cos. Because we could choose either, right? And then what? Just have this shifted over this way or that way and then manipulate it to be one or the other. However, remember that I just mentioned that this particularly eliminates that. It does not want a horizontal shift. You have no choice to have a horizontal shift. So in this case, you have no horizontal shift. You're not allowed. So you can't manipulate this graph to be sine or cosine. In this case, we have to look at the graph and identify if it is a sine or cosine. We are not choosing. You're not choosing, you're identifying. Okay, so to identify which one it is, well, the first thing I would note is that notice that we have a y-intercept at 0, 2. So this means because there is an y-intercept at 0, 2, and it looks like it's symmetric about the y-axis, we can see that this would be a cosine function. This is a cosine function. And we can say because of y-intercept. Because recall, the y-intercept for sine would have been at the origin, but it's not. So this means that we have a cosine function, and that the cosine function now will look like, in this case, y equals a cosine kx plus c. Okay, so let's go ahead and find a, k, and c. So in this case, A is the amplitude, right? And so the amplitude for the normal cosine of x, right? The cosine of x, the amplitude A is equal to 1. That's because the range is -1 to 1. But here we can see that when I go along this periodic function, it doesn't toggle between -1 and 1, right? It's not here. It's actually stretched a little bit vertically, and it goes from -2 to 2. So now we can see that because the range in this function is -2 to 2, that the amplitude A is equal to 2. The next thing we need to know is the period. So I have it over here in this box. Here's the amplitude. Now we're going to identify the period. So the period is 2 pi over b. In this case, our period P is not going to be B, but K in this case, right? So this implies that just with some algebra, that K will be equal to 2 pi over P, the period. So let's go ahead and look at the period. We don't know the B, right? We only know the period, and we can just do this by looking at the graph. So again, the period is just from one peak to the other, right? Just essentially it's a function and it's invertible. And so we could see that one peak to one peak from negative 14 to 0. So what is that distance, right? So 0 to negative 14. So this means that absolute value of k is equal to 2 pi over 14. And this means that k is equal to pi over 7. The next thing would be the phase shift, and that would be the horizontal shift, but we do not have a phase shift, right? Because it specifically wanted us not to have a phase shift, right? So we don't have to worry about that. It's not applicable. As far as the vertical shift, I noticed that it's totally symmetric about the y-axis, and also there is no change in the difference between where the x-axis lies and the distance from the peaks, right? And so if there was a vertical change, we would see this kind of pushed up a little, like up here or down here, and then we would have added or subtracted some sort of y unit. In this case, it just looks like we stretched it here and changed its period. So your vertical shift, which is c, is equal to 0. Okay, so now let's put this all together. So part 3i would be looking at y equals a cosine of kx plus c. And so a we said was 2, which is the amplitude, and b we got from the period, which is pi over 7 x, and then plus the vertical shift, which there was none.